There are final words that make people cry. There are phrases that silence the entire room. But then, there are final words that send chills down your spine, words that haunt you forever. What would you say if you knew these were the final moments of your life? A late apology, a profound philosophical statement, or perhaps a chilling remark that fills everyone with terror. A serial killer casually said, "Kiss my ass," just before being injected with lethal drugs. Another condemned man seemed pleased when death arrived. These final words don't just reveal the psyche of murderers, they leave a haunting mark that chills anyone who hears them. And now, you're about to hear these words. What's coming next may be something you'll never forget. 1. Richard Aaron Cobb. Richard Aaron Cobb wasn't a serial killer, but his actions were horrifying enough to make anyone shudder. In September 2002, Cobb and his accomplices attacked a convenience store in Jacksonville, Texas, not only to rob it, but to feed his sadistic tendencies. He kidnapped 2 female employees and a male customer, then took them to a remote area. There, the innocent victims were forced to face death in a brutal manner. Fortunately, one of them survived and testified, exposing Cobb's cruelty. Cobb's actions weren't just a robbery gone wrong. They were a nightmare that only someone with absolute malice could conceive. 11 years later, when Cobb was led to the death chamber in Texas, he showed no fear whatsoever. When asked if he had any last words, he replied, "I hope that one day the absurdity humanity has reached will come to an end." Moments later, as the lethal drugs began coursing through his body, he said, "Wow, this feels great. Thanks, Warden." Those were the final words of a murderer welcoming his death. Did he truly feel relieved to escape this world, or was he mocking the entire justice system, treating his death sentence as a joke? While we may never know for sure, his words left a chilling imprint on everyone who witnessed that moment. 2. John Wayne Gacy. John Wayne Gacy was a monster in human form, not only killing but terrifying the world with the sheer brutality of his crimes. Gacy was a well-known member of his community, frequently seen at children's parties dressed as a clown. But behind that smile was a terrifying serial killer. Gacy murdered at least 33 people, hiding their bodies under his floorboards, creating his own personal hell within his home. His crimes were not just horrific, his deception was even worse. He convinced people that he was friendly, trustworthy, even a beloved figure in the community, before being caught. No one suspected that beneath his charming exterior lay a cold-blooded murderer with no remorse. Before he was sentenced to death, he made a chillingly cold final statement. "Kiss my ass." Gacy's cruelty made him a notorious figure in popular culture. His story has inspired countless films, both documentary and fictional, about a killer with a seemingly perfect facade. And his death, in a way, was like an open-ended movie, leaving viewers with a sense of shock and many questions about the nature of human evil and crime. 3. Peter Kürten. Peter Kürten, also known as the Vampire of Dusseldorf, was one of the most terrifying criminals in German history. He was infamous for his insatiable bloodlust. Not only did he kill, but he also derived sick pleasure from drinking his victims' blood. Kürten brutally murdered at least 9 people, and what made him even more terrifying was that his motive wasn't hatred or material gain. It was pure gratification from the act of killing itself. Kürten wasn't just a murderer. He was a monster in human form, finding pleasure in every life he took. When he was finally captured, he openly admitted that killing was the only way to satisfy his unquenchable thirst for blood. Facing execution, he asked his psychologist a chilling question. "After my head is chopped off, will I still be able to hear my own blood gushing from my neck?" That would be the ultimate pleasure. His last words were not only deeply disturbing, but also a reflection of his pure evil, devoid of any remorse. His death wasn't just the end of a killer. It was the eradication of a creature who found joy in suffering. This raises a terrifying question. Can criminals like Kürten become icons in film and pop culture? In reality, he has inspired countless depictions of bloodthirsty killers in cinema, not the romanticized vampires we often see, but the kind that truly embody terror. 4. Aileen Wuornos. Aileen Wuornos is one of the most infamous female serial killers in American history. Her story isn't just one of the most well-known murder cases. It also became the inspiration for the movie Monster, in which Charlize Theron played the lead role. The film delves deep into the tragic life of Aileen, exploring the psychological factors that turned her from a victim into a killer. Between 1989 and 1990, Aileen killed 6 men, claiming self-defense in each case. However, the courts didn't buy her explanation, and she was sentenced to death. When the time came for her execution, Aileen didn't show fear. She instead left the world with an eerie statement: "I'll be back on June 6th with Jesus, just like an Independence Day, big mothership and all. I'll be back." Her last words sent chills down the spines of those who heard them. Was this the rambling of a delusional mind? Or did she truly believe she would be resurrected? Whatever the answer, Aileen Wuornos is gone, but her crimes remain an unforgettable part of American criminal history. Monster gave the world a deeper look into her tragic and complex life, showing the pain and darkness behind her crimes. 5. Carl Panzram. Carl Panzram was one of the most ruthless killers in American history. If you thought the previous criminals were terrifying, Panzram would make you think again. He didn't kill out of hatred, greed, or lust. He killed simply because he enjoyed it. And the scariest part? He never hid that fact. Throughout his violent life, Panzram murdered at least 21 people and raped hundreds of victims, including men, women, and children, without a single shred of remorse. When he was finally caught, he proudly confessed to everything, never once trying to justify his actions. The only thing that truly annoyed him was how long it was taking to execute him. On September 5, 1930, as he stood on the gallows, Panzram stared straight at the executioner and sneered, "Hurry it up, you Hoosier bastard. I could kill a dozen men in the time you're taking." His last words were arrogant and dripping with hatred for society. He felt no fear, no weakness. Death came for him the same way it came for his victims: swift, brutal, and with no regrets. 6. James French. James French wasn't a serial killer, but he remains one of the most infamous death row inmates thanks to his dark sense of humor. Originally sentenced to life in prison for murder, French eventually grew tired of incarceration, not because he feared it, but simply because he didn't want to live anymore. However, there was one problem. He didn't want to take his own life. Instead, he wanted the state to do it for him. To ensure that happened, he devised a brutal yet straightforward plan. He killed his cellmate. This act sealed his fate, landing him on death row and securing his appointment with the electric chair on August 10, 1966, just as he had planned. What made James French stand out was the way he embraced death. Showing no fear or remorse, he treated his final moments like a performance. As he spotted a journalist in the execution chamber, he quipped, "If I were you, I'd run with this headline tomorrow. French fries." It was a darkly comedic play on words. His last name, French, combined with fries, referencing the electric chair that was about to take his life. His execution wasn't just a punishment. It was a satirical show, a final punchline from a killer with a morbid sense of humor. In a different life, perhaps, he could have been a stand-up comedian instead of a convicted murderer. 7. Jeffrey David Matthews. Jeffrey David Matthews became infamous not just for his crime, but for his desperate attempt to escape execution. Sentenced to death for murdering his own uncle during a robbery, his crime wasn't just brutal, it was a betrayal of family. But what made Matthews stand out wasn't the murder itself, but the way he faced his impending death. On January 11, 2011, as he awaited execution, there was one last hope: a possible call from the governor of Oklahoma. This call could mean a stay of execution or even clemency. But as the seconds ticked by and the phone remained silent, Matthews smirked and remarked, "I guess the governor's phone is broken. He still hasn't called." A biting, ironic statement spoken with unsettling calmness. He knew no one was coming to save him. No last-minute miracle. Moments later, the lethal injection took effect, bringing an end to his life of crime. 8. Robert Charles Comer. If there were an award for the strangest last words, Robert Charles Comer would be a top contender. Sentenced to death for murdering a man in 1987, Comer spent over 2 decades behind bars before his execution on May 22, 2007. But what set him apart wasn't his crime, it was his bizarre attitude toward death. Throughout his imprisonment, Comer never showed regret or fear. He accepted his fate as if it were just another inevitable step in his journey. As the moment of execution arrived, everyone in the room expected him to say something profound. Instead, he uttered just 2 words: "Go Raiders." Yes, you heard that right. He didn't reflect on his life, his crimes, or his victims. He didn't offer a last-minute apology. He simply cheered for his favorite football team, the Oakland Raiders. Did Comer see his execution as just another game he wasn't going to win? Or was this his way of reminding the world that, even in the face of death, his loyalty to his team never wavered? 9. Robert Alton Harris. Robert Alton Harris wasn't just a murderer, he was a ruthless criminal who took the lives of 2 teenage boys for an utterly senseless reason. In 1978, in San Diego, California, Harris was sentenced to death for killing 2 16-year-old boys. The boys had simply gone out to buy hamburgers when they unknowingly crossed paths with Harris. He stole their car, and instead of just taking the vehicle and leaving, he forced them out and executed them in cold blood. After the killings, Harris casually ate their hamburgers as if nothing had happened, as if human lives were disposable. Convicted in 1979, Harris sat on death row for over a decade before finally facing execution in the gas chamber on April 21, 1992. When his final moment arrived, he showed no remorse, nor did he offer an apology. Instead, he uttered a phrase that carried a philosophical tone. You can be a king or a street sweeper, but everyone dances with the Grim Reaper. At first glance, his words seemed profound. But coming from a man who had murdered 2 innocent teenagers, they only added to his despicable nature. He may have believed that he and his victims were equal in death, but the reality was far different. He had chosen this fate for himself, while his victims never had a choice. 10. Vincent Gutierrez. Vincent Gutierrez is a prime example of a killer who acted without thought or complex motives. He didn't plan, he didn't scheme, he simply pulled the trigger without caring about the consequences. In 1997, he and his accomplices attacked a man to steal his car. When the victim tried to flee, Gutierrez shot him in the back, killing him instantly. A cold-blooded, senseless act, devoid of reason, compassion, or humanity. Sentenced to death later that same year, Gutierrez spent a decade on death row before facing the lethal injection on March 28, 2007. But rather than showing fear or remorse, he turned his execution into a joke. As he was strapped onto the gurney, he casually asked, "Where's my stunt double?" It was either an attempt to mask his fear or a final jab at the justice system, mocking the inevitability of his fate. But no matter the reason behind his words, reality remained unchanged. There was no stunt double, and his role had reached its final scene. 11. James W. Rodgers. James W. Rodgers wasn't a serial killer, but he was dangerous enough to be sentenced to death by firing squad, a rare and nearly obsolete method of execution in modern times. In 1957, Rodgers got into an argument with a coworker at a uranium mine. Instead of settling it with words or walking away, he pulled out a gun and shot the man dead on the spot, an impulsive, fatal decision over a petty dispute. Convicted in 1958, Rodgers waited only 2 years before his execution on March 30, 1960. And when his final moment came, he seized the opportunity to make a dark joke. When asked if he had any last words, he simply shrugged and said, "I requested a bulletproof vest." With that, the execution proceeded, and Rodgers met his end in a hail of bullets, a fittingly ironic conclusion to a man who had killed over something so trivial. 12. Gary Gilmore. Gary Gilmore is one of the most infamous death row inmates in American history, and his final words have become legendary in the annals of executions. Though he wasn't a serial killer, his crimes were shocking enough to captivate the entire nation. In 1976, Gilmore was sentenced to death for killing 2 people during a robbery in Utah. Showing no remorse, he never apologized. He just wanted it all to be over. It was his unwavering determination to face execution that made his story so unique. On January 17, 1977, Gilmore was executed by firing squad. Just moments before the bullets tore through his body, he uttered a short yet chillingly indifferent phrase, "Let's do it." It wasn't a plea, nor an apology. It was a declaration, a final acceptance of his fate, without justification or regret. "Let's do it" would later become a part of American pop culture, symbolizing decisiveness and the willingness to face consequences head-on. Gilmore was not only among the first people executed after the U.S. reinstated the death penalty, but his infamous last words remain etched in history. 13. Sarah Good. Sarah Good was one of the tragic victims of the infamous Salem witch trials in Massachusetts in 1692. She wasn't a criminal or a murderer. She was an innocent woman caught in a wave of hysteria and mass paranoia. Accused of being a witch, she was sentenced to death despite the lack of any real evidence against her. On July 19, 1692, Sarah Good was hanged. But before she died, she shouted a chilling curse at her accuser. "I am no more a witch than you are a wizard. If you take my life, God will give you blood to drink." Her final words weren't just the desperate cries of an innocent woman. They were a haunting warning against the dangers of fear-driven injustice. Sarah Good's death became a powerful symbol of the horrors that blind fanaticism can bring, a reminder of the deadly consequences of mass hysteria. 14. Torrey Twane McNabb. Torrey Twane McNabb was a ruthless killer who took the life of a police officer in Alabama in 1997. His crime shocked the community, but it was his final words that revealed the depths of his anger and hatred toward the justice system and the society that condemned him. On October 19, 2017, as he prepared for his lethal injection, McNabb showed nothing but defiance. When asked if he had any last words, he boldly declared, "Mom, sis, look into my eyes. I have no tears. I'm not afraid. Alabama, I hate you. I hate you." His words weren't just a rejection of the system that sentenced him to death. They were a bitter expression of deep-seated rage and resentment toward the very place where he had lived and committed his crimes. It was a final act of defiance from a man consumed by hatred, leaving behind nothing but anger and regret. 15. Thomas J. Grasso. Thomas J. Grasso was a cold-blooded murderer, known for killing 2 elderly people to steal from them. But what made him infamous wasn't just his crimes. It was his bizarre last words before facing execution. On March 20, 1995, just before being administered the lethal injection, Grasso left everyone in the execution chamber stunned with an unusual complaint. "I did not get my SpaghettiOs. I got spaghetti. I want the press to know this." A joke? A trivial protest? No one could quite understand why. In his final moments, he chose to focus on a meal rather than express any remorse. Instead of reflecting on his crimes, he made an absurd remark about his last meal, almost as if he saw his execution as nothing more than a stage for one last act of mockery. Grasso's death leaves us wondering, was this his way of dealing with his fate, or was it a final testament to his indifference toward life and death? Either way, his last words remain one of the strangest ever spoken on death row. 16. Clarence Ray Allen. Clarence Ray Allen was one of California's most notorious criminals, responsible for a series of brutal murders in the 1980s. He was sentenced to death for orchestrating the killings of 3 people, a woman and 2 men, all of whom were executed in a cold and ruthless manner. Even after years behind bars, he showed no remorse for his crimes. On January 17, 2006, just before receiving his lethal injection, Allen uttered a final statement that left a lasting impression. "Coca hey, today is a good day to die." These words reflected not just his calm acceptance of death, but also a chilling sense of indifference, an unwavering brutality that had not faded with time. Spoken with eerie composure and arrogance, His last words remain one of the most unsettling in the history of capital punishment. The last words of these criminals are more than just sentences. They are the final punctuation marks on lives filled with darkness and regret. Some may evoke anger, others sadness, and some may leave us questioning the very nature of human psychology. But one thing is undeniable. Each of these final statements has left a lasting mark in history. So, the question remains, can we find truth in these last words? Or are they merely echoes of lost souls trying to justify the unforgivable? Some believe that death is a form of release. But perhaps, for these individuals, it was nothing more than the final stop in a long road of irreversible choices, never a redemption, never an absolution. For those of us still living, what can we take away from these haunting last words? Maybe they will disturb us, or maybe they will serve as a powerful reminder. Life is short, and no crime can ever be truly escaped. And, while we may eventually forget the details of their crimes, these final words will continue to echo, unforgettable, lingering in the shadows of history. But before you leave this video, we invite you to explore another fascinating aspect of death row, the last meals of condemned prisoners. Some chose shockingly bizarre requests, while others made food choices filled with hidden meaning. Hit the like button, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you won't miss any spine-chilling stories. And let us know in the comments, do you think death is a release or simply the final consequence of an unfixable past? We look forward to hearing your thoughts. Thanks for watching, and see you in the next video.